Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Boy, I tell you what, I bought this book a good little while back. It is Zion Symbolism in Hebrews chapter 12, 18 to 24, as a hermeneutical key to the epistle. It's by Ki Wong Son. I read through it and gleaned an awful lot from it, but boy, I've been going back through it because I'm doing this. I'm writing a book on the last day, the last hour, the last trumpet, resurrection. And I'm going through the Old Testament prophetic text, particularly in Isaiah, to show that the language of Sukkot, the last feast day of Israel, of the seven, is directly related, intertwined with, inseparably so, the concept of the end-time regathering of Israel to Zion. In other words, in the Old Testament, when we see the prophecies of the last days, when we see the prophecies of the latter end, etc., and the ingathering to Zion, what we are seeing there is a reference that is commonly missed because we are not familiar enough with the festal language of the Old Testament. But what we're seeing there is an allusion to the fulfillment of the Feast of Sukkot. The Feast of Sukkot was the Feast of the Harvest. It was the Feast of the ingathering. It is inextricably bound up with the day of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the new creation. And so all of those motifs, they're part of a matrix of Old Testament prophecy. And as I said, far too often we're not familiar enough with all of those interacting motifs. And so we say, well, the gathering to Zion in the Old Testament. And we don't realize that is a festal reference. So anyway, this book, Zion Symbolism in Hebrews, is really quite a remarkable book. Mr. Ki Wong Son is, so far as I know, not tremendously well known, but he's a full academic, and the book was produced by Paternoster Press, so it's obviously a scholarly book. So anyway, just wanted to share that with you, kind of let you know what I'm working on, by the way. Boy, I tell you what, this whole imagery of Sukkot and the end times ingathering, the end times harvest, is incredible. Be looking for that book. Lord willing, it will be published this year. I told my wife just the other day, boy, every time I think I'm making some really good progress, I find a whole bunch more new research. I find a whole lot more evidence, more scholarly information. It's just like, oh, I got to have that in there. I got to have that in there. So, yeah, I'm in love with the material. Okay, back to Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. We are told that because Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following has to do with the gathering of the nations for the time of the judgment, that obviously that hasn't happened because nobody saw it happen. A noted scholar in the amillennial world, Churches of Christ circles, some years ago, a man that I had a deep, deep appreciation for, a true academic, but when he encountered full preterism, his response was, my eyes are not seeing what my ears are hearing. Now that was an incredible statement for this man to make, because he had written extensively against dispensationalism, pointing out the spiritual, i.e. the unseen nature of the fulfillment of God's Old Testament promises concerning the kingdom. So here is a man, when arguing against dispensationalism, said the establishment of the kingdom, all of the related tenets there, the dispensationalist says, my eyes are not seeing what my ears are hearing. And this scholar said, you're looking with the wrong eyes. You're listening with the wrong ears. But when it came to preterism, what did he do? He made the exact precise arguments that the dispensationalists do against his doctrine. He rejects that principle over here. He accepted it over here. I had the opportunity to sit down and talk with him just a few months before he passed away. And I simply could not believe what I was hearing from him when I pointed out the disparity. He literally sat there, hung his head in silence for a good bit, and he told me, he said, Don, I just simply don't feel like discussing this at this time. And look, in all deference and respect, he was tremendously ill, and so I wasn't going to press the issue. But the point being, ladies and gentlemen, even though we might look at these passages like Matthew 25:31 and following from a modern Western Grecian worldview, and while we may say my eyes are not seeing what my ears are hearing, our challenge, as I've shared with you on my morning musings many, many times, our challenge is to read these scriptures not through our modern cosmological, social view, but to view it through the eyes of the Hebraic writers and to read it through the prism of the Hebraic audience. That's a challenge. And it's one that, I struggle with even to this day. So, here's the bottom line and what we are getting at here. And we've got a whole lot more that we're going to look at in regard to Matthew chapter 25:31 and following, and its relationship to Joel chapter 3. We've got at least one or two more points that I want to make on that comparison, demonstrating the demand for a first century fulfillment of Matthew chapter 25:31 and following. But I'm going to defer that until next week. Here's what I want to share with you today. Matthew chapter 25:31 and following is, obviously, the judgment of the nations, right? Okay. Is that the same judgment in Matthew chapter 16:27? The Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father and will reward every man according to his works. And 99.9% of the commentators say, well, of course that's the same thing. I was raised believing that Matthew 16:27 is the end of time. I have numerous commentaries all over my audience by futurists who say Matthew 16:27, end of time. Oh, wait, verse 28. Verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Oh, wait, that's either Pentecost or, as some postmillennialists tell us, like Gentry and DeMar, etc., that's AD 70. So what happens? They put Matthew 16:27, end of time, then they jump backward in time, 2,000 years so far and counting, and they say verse 28 is Pentecost or AD 70. Now, what's absolutely amazing about this, the commentators who do this absolutely and adamantly reject the dispensational practice of inserting humongous gaps of time into texts where none is suggested. I mean, it's absolutely astounding. In 1983, I attended a formal public debate between Wayne Jackson, who recently passed away, great guy in many ways, and Robert Shank. Robert Shank had been a professor at a Baptist seminary for years and years. He came to reject Calvinism, so he was essentially booted out of the seminary, and he became a member of the Churches of Christ. But he still espoused dispensationalism. So the debate was between Wayne Jackson, amillennialist, and Robert Shank. Now, Robert Shank, both of these men at the time were friends of mine, okay? Robert Shank had spent time in my family's home, supported financially in his ministry. So he was no stranger to me. We went out to eat together during that formal debate, or during the time of that debate, for which, by the way, I got castigated as eating with heretics. But he was a friend of mine, for crying out loud. Anyway, during the debate, Wayne Jackson castigated and condemned Robert Shank for claiming that there's a 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 70th week of AD 70. By the way, I posed a question to Brother Shank in the Q&A session that he admitted was an extremely good question, and in fact, the very best question he had encountered. But Jackson castigated him, Shank, for inserting a gap of 2,000 years between the 69th and the 70th week. However, when it came to discussing Matthew 16, 27, and 28, in the book of that debate, okay, 1983, Pearl Street Church of Christ lectureship. You can look it up. You can buy a copy of it. Wayne Jackson took the view, Matthew 16, 27, end of time. Matthew 16, 28, day of Pentecost. So what did Wayne Jackson do? He did the identical thing that he condemned Robert Shank for doing, and that's inserting a 2,000-year gap into the text where no gap is indicated. None. I called him out on that years later because I wrote some articles in regard to that debate. Jackson never responded a word to what I had to say. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the fact is, and I've gone over this before, so I will not spend a lot of time, but what we have in Matthew 16 is the coming of the Son of Man with the angels in the judgment of all men. And in Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, we have the coming of the Son of Man with the angels in the judgment and reward of all men. So here's my question to you. What is the difference? Well, amillennialists and postmillennialists would say, well, there's no difference whatsoever. It's just that Matthew 16, 27 is the end of time, just like Matthew chapter 25, 31. There's a problem. Matthew chapter 16, 28 begins in the Greek with amin, lego, humin, a term that is used 95 times in the New Testament and never breaks a subject, never, ever introduces a new subject. The term amin, lego, humin calls attention to what is about to be said that is going to emphasize what has just been said. You know what that means? Stated simply, verse 28 is talking about the same thing as verse 27 and emphasizing verse 27. How does verse 28 emphasize verse 27? By saying, verily I say unto you, some standing here will not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom, which means they would not die until they saw the Son of Man coming with the angels in power and great glory in the judgment of all men, which is Matthew chapter 25, verse 31, and it means they would not die before they saw it happen. And thus, that means that Matthew chapter 25, 31 applied to AD 70. That means that Matthew 25, 31 and following is not an end of time event. And it means that Matthew 24 and 25 are not divided into two separate subjects unless you can prove definitively that amin, lego, humin in Matthew 16, 28 divides the two verses. Unless you can prove that the term suggests a radical temporal break between verse 27 and verse 28. Unless you can prove that amin, lego, humin is being used in a totally distinctive way from all other occurrences And you can't do that by saying, well, obviously verse 27 hasn't happened yet, therefore that must be true. No, no, no. That's not proof. If it's true that amin lego humin never breaks a subject, never introduces a new subject, then it must be true that Christ came with the angels in the judgment of all men in his kingdom in the lifetime of the first century generation. And again, the Olivet Discourse is not divided. Hey, thank you for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. Don't forget, tomorrow we have video number 2 on why Wright, N.T. Wright, is wrong about the redemption of creation. I'll see you on the flip side.